What questions are you grappling with at the moment?
I'm feeling very bold now that I'm about to come out to the whole of the world, seeing you're recording this. The two things, oh, sorry, my neighbours do deliveries, so you might be having scooters screaming up and down. So just ignore them, I will. I think I might be becoming a Tory. And then the other thing is I've lost both confidence and fluency. And that's been a real shaker. And when I say it, I'm encouraged that other people say, oh, that's happened to me. But when you're my age, you start to think, will I ever get it back? Or will it just get worse? So there's a real cotton wool sense of incompetence. So I don't just say that to appeal to your better natures, but I suspect the lockdown and the lack of sociability might have had quite a, so that's a question for me. The Tory bit I'm prepared to talk about. And I heard, Keir Starmer's published this big paper that he's written. And I heard informed people commenting that he only mentioned social justice once. And I'm thinking, why has my appetite in relation to social justice changed so appreciably? Because some of you may or may not know, one of my expertise, in inverted commas, is aging. And it's very well documented that as we get older, we become, I suppose, more right-wing. And I'm thinking, but literally it's happened overnight. So that's a big, should I carry on, or am I already?
I'm intrigued as to what you're using Tory, becoming more a Tory, as shorthand for something. I'm intrigued.
Shorthand for, we'd better battle more with our circumstances rather than point the finger to others being responsible for my situation. And of course, that becomes quite raw with the challenge of Black Lives Matter. So I've felt the best thing I can do in relation to Black Lives Matter is to shut up and do a lot of listening, because I can feel myself with all sorts of questionable emotions saying, but everybody has to battle with circumstances. And as we were talking, perhaps you could pool in about the difference between suffering and affliction.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yeah. It's something that Simone Weil, who was a philosopher in the early part of the last century, wrote about, was that there's a difference between suffering and affliction. In truth, what she's saying is we all kind of suffer, but actually the afflicted ones are those who experience psychological, emotional, economic, physical pressure and suffering all simultaneously. And they are the afflicted ones, whereas ourselves in suffering, and I often think about it in terms of poverty, where if you experience poverty, you are afflicted by poverty, but we also, as human beings, in and around trying to respond, actually pick up some of the suffering of poverty ourselves and embody that ourselves, not as something that we observe, but a part of it.
Yeah. So accepting that distinction, I feel as if I had any praxis, which I don't, I just sort of live in Streatham and go to church and do my best. There's nothing, but that's it. I'm starting to give a renewed value to tiny little instances. And I can justify it because it feels as if when we've almost lost our, we, people, have lost the urge for sociability. It might just be that my neighbours, because they're always going out delivering stuff, I don't ask what they're delivering, by the way. Each time they go out and deliver something, it's about somebody staying in their own household. And that might be a household event, but it might just be a singleton, a person alone. And I suspect there are so many entertainments and enticements that you do when you're alone, and many will be quite shameful, that the appetite to move outside and associate might have been damaged quite significantly. And so I'm left saying the best initiative I've ever seen, and I want to see more of, is something like Pecan. And you have to be of a certain age to, Pecan's still going. It was in Peckham, still is, but Peckham was kind of an unredeemed, pretty heavy duty area, very high unemployment. And the churches working together actually knocked on people's doors in order to say, almost to give stepping stones for people to associate. And it's that kind of very precise, tiny, respectful offering that suddenly appeals to me, rather than, if you want, a charge for social justice. And that's, yeah, that's what's sort of going on in my mind.
And how big a shift is that for you? From
I think it's always been in the background.
Yeah.
See, and I think it might be male, female as well. Just to, that somehow the patient association that builds up a neighborhood might well be a gendered task. Although I can remember saying that once and then giving some illustrations about my neighborhood, and it was all about men helping me out. So I'm very dubious about pushing that one too far. But that re-neighboring role, which I can remember, it was something in the States about 20, 30 years ago. It feels as if we're now needing to bring that back to the fore.
And is that partly that COVID has kind of made that more sharp? Has it brought it into sharp relief? Do you think it was there before, or do you think actually the processes of COVID has clarified some of that?
Well, I think we've always underestimated our propensity for addictive behaviour, which might just be akin to a kind of idleness, and that intentionality, intentional behaviour, is something that it feels like belongs to earlier generations. I'm reading what's her name? Miriam Margolyes, her autobiography. And she's very open about her Jewishness. And she gets a bit of street cred because her mum was born in Kirkdale in Liverpool. And if you know Liverpool, if you're born in Kirkdale, you've got some wounds of poverty to negotiate. Except that her dad began with second-hand furniture and moved into running a big superstore. And she then describes her granddad from being somebody who was a tinker, selling stuff around the doors, to having a very successful jewellery thing. And I'm thinking that we'd call that entrepreneurship, but it represents a huge amount of intentional behaviour, rather than just allowing life to come day, next day. And I don't know how to evaluate that. That fits into, am I becoming a Tory? And it's going to be a big issue, because that's clearly what the current government wants people to do, to, you know, to get a job and better themselves. And I'm thinking, is there anything wrong with that? And maybe there isn't. So you can see how mixed up I am. And you rogues are recording this.
Well, we'll edit the bits that you want editing out.
Oh, you won't.
In the yeah, we will. I like this idea of association. You use that word a lot, and you use it almost am I right in thinking that you see there being a kind of a deficit of association at the moment?
Yeah, a deficit of association, and then that easily moves into a deficit of intentional behaviour,
Okay.
which is a cousin of transformation. So my best mate, Baroness Richardson, Methodist, used to always say that ordinary people, we need to hear ourselves think. And I don't think we've got places where people can hear themselves think. And if I suspect people are into a kind of rumination throughout lockdown, going over the same ground, getting more and more caught up in it. And then I'm left saying, well, where can we go to hear ourselves think? And that offer is a very important offer. And I don't see any agency offering it, although the churches very easily could, and I'd be tempted to say should. And I think Methodism was about people having the opportunity to hear themselves think. That's what the class and further on in, you know, in as you developed as a Methodist. So that's how people, I think, claim the intentional strength to engage in transformation. But as I hear myself think, I'm thinking, this is also individualistic. So I'm shocked by that.
But in some ways, that is a product of the age, isn't it? That's how we are being taught to think. And even though we might want to resist it, actually it's almost how the world has become. So we start from the world as it is rather than from the world as we think it should be.
Yeah. I think essentially I trust people to think for themselves.
Yeah.
But I am concerned that there is so little opportunity for that.
Yeah.
But maybe there is. Maybe it's just, you know, I'm missing. The other bit, by the way, that's making me worry that I've become a Tory is Sam Wells. And a book, God, you're recording this, aren't you? I always think Sam Wells, if only he'd write less and speak less, would be able to see the quality of some of his thoughts. And the book that really did absolutely stun me, and I'm amazed that, if you want, our networks aren't talking more about it, is that book, For Good, The Church and the Future of Welfare. And basically he's saying that Beveridge and the welfare state gets focused on needs meeting. It's all about deficit. And he, like many of us, would want a more kind of positive, appreciative approach to understanding locales and people. And so he says that the church's job isn't to address wants and define people's needs and respond to people's needs, although that's a bit kind of black and white. But that our task is to cultivate society's assets. And so he's starting to give a value to social goods, relationship, I'm reading now, relationship, creativity, partnership, compassion, and joy. And he says that's what churches can do. And I can see and cite instances where churches do this. And I can now use that as some important jigsaw pieces on the journey to transformation. Whereas I think you might know Heart's Edge. I don't know, is it Heart's Edge or
No,
Heart?
it's Heart Edge.
Heart
Without,
Edge.
yeah.
Which is this network that's been set up around St. Martin's in the Field. And I've struggled to understand what it's about. And I think what it is about is trying to encourage and foster churches to cultivate those 5 goods and earn some money in the process. So I'm left thinking, if I was doing a strategy, if I had my time again, I'd probably be lining up around these 5 goods. And I think, gosh, I think I'd be banned from the brownies with such conservatism.
It's a long way from Liverpool Bootle, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. And part of it, the reason why it's like more modest steps is because of taking our vulnerability, both personally and as a species, taking that vulnerability more seriously and just not trusting large strides that we've called progress. It's felt as if when I look at, I'll use the word progress. It seems historically to have been a compilation of multiple tiny efforts rather than a big social policy development. Although having said that, Beveridge and the health service were pretty major, but it's, yeah, I don't know, you can see that tension there. So I'm left saying vulnerability, good for mission, because when we feel vulnerable, there's perhaps a moment when we might be able to feel that God is at our shoulder. Even though we don't believe in God, I think the experience of God can nullify the failure to believe in God. That gratitude and generosity feel like important therapeutic steps. That indignation is perhaps a more powerful emotion than we realize, that helping people to get to that state where we say that won't do is an important stepping off point. Although there's a shadow side to indignation, it's got to be handled well because it's a powerful emotion. And then I'm left saying, can we have more urban expression, Eden type initiatives? Because it feels as if they tick all my Tory boxes. That's enough for you to talk about.
Yeah, there's an awful lot for you to talk about. I want to push a little bit on a couple of those. When you talk about indignation, because I get what you're saying, which is actually people to almost like Paulo Freire might say, become aware of their circumstances, become aware of that. But it feels like that in a UK context, the levels of apathy that often exist feel very difficult to get from there to a place where people care enough to want to speak and to want to believe that they can change. And I'm interested, and you've watched things for many years and been involved in things for many years. Where have you seen those places where you kind of go that they manage to enable people to show that?
This won't do. The first time I think I saw it, and I thought, wow, was in Sinn Féin. If anybody knows Derby, you'll know Sinn Féin. And it came about with coffee and tea and some toast after kids had been dropped off at school. Just a group of mums and carers took the space in the already battered church hall for an hour and a bit to talk as just neighbours, really. But they had extraordinary adeptness at prayer, and they prayed as if there was no squeamishness about it. It was you needed an extra hand, and if praying was an extra hand, then have it. And it was interesting, I hate that word. It was a privilege to see them battle with their individual struggles, whether it be how many cigarettes they were smoking, all, their swearing in front of the kids, their relationship with their son, all that sort of stuff would be prayed for. And the next day, they would ask each other how they got on the day before. And that felt to me that's about as good as it gets, really, in terms of association. But then it moved into saying there are things in Sinn Fin, the things about the school, that really, they're not good. And so that personal passion shifted into a more communal passion. So that would be one. Not many, but then you've got me cotton wool thing, so I need notice of that question, really. But Sinn Fin sticks.
Yeah, that's one that sticks out. The other thing that
I know there's another one.
Go on, then.
Let me just get from Scotland. And it's from Martin's work. I have huge benefit from seeing Martin's work. This is Martin Johnson, who used to be in charge of priority area work in Scotland. And it's now in the media about how much drug addiction and damage drugs are wrought in Scotland. And there was a guy who I had interviewed as part of a research thing for the Church of Scotland. And he'd been in prison 18 years. And I'd learned not to ask when anybody's been in 18 years. You don't really want to know what that was about. And he was indignant that people didn't realise how good the Church of Scotland was in these housing schemes. But then he became indignant, and I remember this plaintive cry, there must be something I can do. Because, of course, with safeguarding, it was, hands off, there's nothing for you. And yet he was the one who knew, what was it, affliction and suffering, and affliction and suffering in spades. And our structures said, there's nothing you can offer, because, and that's that indignation, and the fact that he'd recognised the problems both for those who might be receiving his offer of help and his own now limbo because of this huge criminal record.
One of the things as you're talking, and as you keep saying about you might be becoming more Tory, I'm intrigued about, is that often we get very nervous around notions like self-interest, which are often, about how the individual achieves what they want to achieve. But it seems to me that as you're talking about it, you're more generous in that regard. You kind of see self-interest not as a wholly bad thing that can be very destructive towards others, but actually can be something that's quite generative. Would that be right? And if so, do you want to just explain a bit about what you mean by it?
I've been shaken by how dismayed youngsters are about the future. It's nothing compared to the shadow of the bomb that was, you know, the shadow over my teenage years, or Vietnam. You know, it's nothing. It's so much more helplessness. And I do think that we've somehow got to restore not just faith in God, but faith in Homo sapiens to be able to change our ways. Because if we lose that, then we move into a horrible downward spiral of despair, nihilism, actually. So I think underneath what I'm saying is that there is an aspect of humankind that can be trusted. Now, I think it then gets enlarged by being a faithful follower of Jesus. And the following of Jesus is a pretty good recipe for bringing out the best in us. So underneath there is a trust in humankind, not just a trust in some of humankind.
Yeah. And so you build from that rather than necessarily see it something to be combated.
Yeah.
Just want to come back. We followed the strand that you started to talk about becoming more Tory. What we haven't touched on is the confidence and fluency.
Oh gosh,
But I think that's really worth exploring, because I think I don't know about others, but I'd certainly resonate with. I think for myself, there's been greater hesitancy in how I've operated over the last 18 months, and a greater kind of feeling and trying to, you know, not being as maybe as secure as before that. And I'm interested in how that worked for you. And I know you say that you knowing a little of you will have talked to other people about that. Is that a consistency that you're observing?
Yes, I think Lambeth, great London borough. It really is a really good London borough. One of its initiatives has been to encourage streets to have a street party, and they'd help with, you know, closing it off from traffic and things like that. And it went round, you know, our road could have a street party, and I let it pass because I couldn't find. I knew I'd love to organise a street party. I just love it. But I couldn't find the trajectory that could face responsibility. And to find, if you use just the silly kind of metaphor of a car, I couldn't find a way to move from first gear into second gear. And that has shaken me, because it's not because I'm, you know, I'm not doing any work, you know, I haven't got anything to do. So why can't I do a street party? So that, you know, that has shaken me. And I'm thinking I could put it down to the pandemic, but it might be other things. And there's something about not just feeling secure, but feeling safe. And it may be that there's been a kind of sub message of people are too much into them and us, that people will not behave respectfully to each other. And that I've imbibed that from the telly and things like that, you know, people are rotten rather than trustworthy.
It strikes me that in both sets of questions, there are, how you view human beings really matters. You know, how you respond, how you see them, how you then respond to them because of your view of them. Actually is a basic building block.
And I think the business of intentionality comes in here, because Streatham, where I live, is a gloriously diverse area. It really is. It's a great delight, really. But every time I go onto the pavement, I know that I'm going to make a choice about how I'm going to respond to difference. And I know what the ought is, but sometimes I don't get to that ought, and I can feel, I'll use the posh word because it protects me, ressentiment, a kind of resentment. And I'm thinking, if I'm feeling that, and I'm supposed to be a formed Christian, I wonder what's going on for others. And that dynamic of ressentiment. And it feels as if it's so cross-cutting around so many issues, whether it's how you voted in relation to Brexit, whether it's age now, whether it's ethnicity, all those features. It feels as if walking to Lidl on the pavement, I'm involved in an intentional choice, whether to allow resentment to come upon me or to say we're all God's loved children.